Welcome, everyone. In today's interview, we will talk with Thomas Bak about the neuroanatomy in bilingual language processing. We will try to chat about whether multilingualism is medicine or poison. Thomas Bak is a cognitive neuroscientist. He is currently a reader at the University of Edinburgh, whose work centers on the impact of bilingualism on cognitive functions, bilingualism and cognitive functions across the lifespan, cross-linguistic studies of aphasia, and the relationship between language, cognition, and culture in neurodegenerative brain diseases. Thomas Bak was born in Krakow, but nowadays he lives in Edinburgh, where he works in the Department of Psychology, the Center for Clinical Brain Sciences, and the Center for Cognitive Aging and Cognitive Epidemiology. Welcome, Professor Thomas Bak.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation.
Okay, so maybe let's start with a general question. Could you tell us, are there any important differences between the brains of bilinguals, monolinguals, and multilinguals?
Well, to start with, I would say human brain is potentially multilingual. So we have a lot of papers, and I have to say, mea culpa, I was part of it, which kind of say bilinguals do this, bilinguals do that, or bilingual brain is like this, and so on. The more I study the topic, and particularly the more I study it in context, so looking at our past, and I mean past the last 10 and hundreds thousands of years rather than the last 100 years, and the situation across the world, the more it became clear to me that in fact multilingualism is probably the normal natural state of human brain, mind, and society. And monolingualism is the odd one out, the odd thing which needs to be explained. So the more I study it, the more I'm convinced that multilingualism is in fact the normal natural state of human brain, mind, and society, and has been so for most of the last thousands and thousands of years. There are good reasons to assume that human language developed originally in multilingual settings. And in fact, if we look at the hunter-gatherer societies which still exist, or early agricultural ones, from Amazon through Africa to Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australia, we find that the rule is that people usually speak more languages. In fact, many societies, it is considered basically taboo to marry someone speaking the same language. This is called by linguistic exogamy. That means that every child grows up with two parents speaking different languages, and indeed 4 grandparents speaking different languages. So from my point of view, I would say the normal state of human brain is to use 3 to 4 languages. Below is something I would call linguistic deprivation, and above it is something which I would call extra multilingualism, and so on. And just to illustrate that, it's not just a kind of complete theoretical thing, I can tell you of a talk I gave several years ago in Entebbe in Uganda to the African Society of Neuroscientists. And the first question by someone with whom I'm now in touch on Twitter, Tom Tago from Ghana, was, "Sir, that's all very interesting, but I come from Ghana, and in Ghana, we have, basically everybody speaks 3 to 4 languages. Is it much better for my brain if I speak 6, 7, or 8 or more?" So basically, in many places, that would be the starting rate, and in fact I am planning soon to go to Israel, and there as well finding a monolingual person would be almost impossible. So from this point of view, I would say the rule is that our brain is extremely well constructed to learn several languages, and if we don't do it, it's simply because it's lack of exposure.
Okay, thank you for this very fascinating answer and all these examples. So let me dig a little bit deeper. You said that our brain seems to be wired to learn multiple languages, but still, from research in neuroscience, we constantly hear that there are different factors that influence how the bilingual brain develops, and also like some studies that show that bilingualism may have neuroprotective effects on our brains. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what matters for these differences to occur. So for example, does the number of languages matter, or does the age of acquisition of the first foreign language matter, or does the proficiency matter? So what is the key factor here?
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, in order to explain it, I need to kind of give a second contextual information, which is important. And that is, I would say, a dramatic change in our understanding of the brain over the last, let's say, 30, 40 years. So the kind of the 20 years before and after the magical year 2000. When I started working in this field, which was in the 80s, the predominant idea of the brain was called modularism. So basically, brain was seen a little bit like a chest of drawers, and here you have languages, and here you have mathematics, and here you have this and that. So you have quite the formulation then used by Jerry Fodor was informationally encapsulated units, which don't really interact very much. Now, the situation couldn't be more different. We think of the brain as a giant network in which basically things are connected and can be connected, so the same area, the same cell, and so on, can be connected to different networks. Now, this is fundamentally important for our understanding of multilingualism, because in the modular system, it's very difficult to accommodate different languages. So automatically the question comes up, so if you speak more languages, do you have different language modules? And if you have them, do they take space that, you then don't have to learn math or engineering or other useful things in life? Or is it one module, but then how do you explain that, we don't mix languages constantly and so on? So modularism is not really very at ease in accommodating multilingualism. In contrast, if you think about different networks, then it is something which is very almost natural. You can have, for instance, nodes which belong to different networks. You can have nodes that are language specific. So it's no problem to explain that we could have at the same time some shared parts of the network and some specific. Now, this is important in order to answer your question about age of acquisition and protective factors and so on. Because depending when we learn something during lifetime, it might have different effects on the brain. And in fact, Professor Zofia Wodniecka was one of the first showing different effects of language learning or bilingualism on the brain depending on different stages in life when we learn it. So things are different, and not necessarily one is better than the other. And this is very important to explain to people, because the question that I always get asked is it really better to learn languages early? Well, it depends. If your main task is to speak a language so that basically people think you are a native speaker, then the earlier you do it, the better. But if you learn a language in order to broaden your understanding of the world, to broaden your horizons, or indeed to have a mental exercise, then learning them later might be more important. Why? Because the earlier we learn things, the more they are likely to be automatized. So we'll be speaking very, very quickly, we don't even think about it, and in a way, it's also a phenomenon with proficiency, but generally, if we learn a language early and becomes proficient, it is automatized. You don't really think about the words, about the formulations when you produce them. You can do it very fast. And generally, you are less likely to produce errors. Now, on one hand, this, you could say, is something positive, something to aspire to. But if you do things automatically, also don't reflect very much on them. So, learning languages later means that it becomes difficult or even impossible, as you can hear from my Polish accent in English, to adjust completely and automatize things completely. But it gives us the opportunity to reflect. We are doing it in a much more conscious way. And there is a beautiful metaphor, in fact, by Vladimir Vygotsky, the Russian psychologist of the early 20th century, who was saying that basically learning another language for a child means like taking his mind above so that he wins the ability to abstract, because he or she starts realizing the language dependence of our concepts, our way of thinking, and so on. So from this point of view, learning later might be in fact better. And if you think about it from the point of view of protection against disease and so on, then I would almost say the later the better. Why? Let me give you a metaphor. If you have someone who wants to play tennis to win Wimbledon, you'd rather start very early. I mean, if you really want to be a Wimbledon master in tennis. But if you want to play tennis in order to remain fit, it's not that important what you do as a teenager. It's important what you do in your 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. So from this point of view, a person who in fact won Wimbledon and from that day stopped having any exercise will not be a very fit 70-year-old. Whereas a person who started with 50 might be a 70-year-old. So from this point of view, learning languages at different stages in life has different advantages and disadvantages, which relate, of course, to how this is done in the brain. In one case, much more through the automatic route, in the other, more through reflective, comparative route, and so on, but both have their advantages.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to continue a little bit more in this topic. So could you tell us a little bit about any medical or clinical implications? So you said it may be a little bit more beneficial, well, cognitively beneficial to start learning languages later in life as well. So to not be discouraged that, you know, I'm not a baby anymore, so I'm not going to be a proficient and fully automatized speaker of a given language. Are there any research showing that it actually helps us in, well, different things? So are there any medical or clinical implications of learning multiple languages later in life?
Well, there are several studies suggesting it, and that is in fact the way in which I entered this whole field as researcher. So my background is originally medicine. Not psychology, linguistics, but medicine. But as I have been always very interested in languages, I was looking for a PhD which could kind of combine language and medicine, and I did it on aphasia, language disorders. And then over the following decades, my work was mainly on language disorders in different brain diseases, in stroke, in dementia, in Parkinsonian syndromes, and so on and so on. And it's only after the seminal paper by Ellen Białystok and her group from Toronto in 2007, who showed that bilingualism delays the onset of dementia by 4 to 4.5 years, that I got really interested in the topic of bilingualism, not just as a kind of private hobby, but as a subject of study. And so this study was really, that I mentioned, was very important because for the first time you could really see medical advantages of speaking more than one language. But one of the main points of criticism was, and that is not the fault of the authors, every population has its limitation, that of course in Toronto where they worked, most people who were multilingual had an immigrant background, either as first generation or maybe a second generation immigrants, so the parents were immigrants. So from this point of view, it's the question is, do we have these differences because of language or because of maybe other factors, genetic factors, food, lifestyle, and so on and so on. The 2007 Białystok study changed really the landscape in that bilingualism became now a topic for people interested in dementia and in neurological diseases. However, the problem was because the authors were working with a population in Toronto in which a lot of bilinguals were either first or second generation immigrants, could have different genetic, different lifestyle, food, diet, and so on, background, it was difficult to be sure that this is really due to language. However, working together with Suvarna Alladi, a colleague of mine whom I met in Cambridge for the first time and who worked then in Hyderabad in India, we could show in an even bigger study, looking at population which has been basically multilingual for hundreds of years, so immigration was not a factor here, we found exactly the same delay. So we did a couple of studies later on, basically suggesting that this delay is particularly pronounced in so-called different variants of frontotemporal dementia. So it depends on the type of dementia. We could show that it is independent of education status in that people who have no formal education whatsoever, illiterates, in this group the difference is even bigger, 6 years. In India, you can have people who don't go to school, who learn the languages basically on the street, from working, and there the difference was even bigger, 6 years. So it's not that people go to better schools and therefore learn languages and have better performance. Then we complemented it by studies from stroke patients where the assumption was exactly the opposite. So if there is something called cognitive reserve, so it means that having mental training, and bilingualism is one of examples of it, can make your brain more resistant to disease, you would expect at least two things. Firstly, negative things should happen slower. So here we have dementia occurring later. But on the other hand, recovery, positive things, should happen faster. And that's exactly what we found as well. So in patients under stroke, there was no difference in age between monolinguals and bilinguals. So it's not speaking as many languages as you want will not really make you more resistant to stroke if you have the risk factors. But after stroke, the recovery was faster, and over 40% of bilinguals, but less than 20% of monolinguals recovered their cognitive functions fully. So from this point of view, we have here, so to say, a converging evidence from different medical conditions suggesting a positive effect, and this is strengthened further through another study which I did in Edinburgh, suggesting that cognitive aging is, so to say, less profound or slower if people know more than one language. So we have basically converging evidence from different sources, which all, let's say, is best explained by the idea of cognitive reserve, by the idea of the practice of learning and speaking and using different languages being basically a mental training which can have beneficial effects.
Okay, thank you very much. So it really seems that bilingualism has a potential, or is really a very powerful shield for our brain. And related to that, trying to kind of ask the question from a different perspective. Several times, or well, in general, often, researchers working on bilingualism receive questions from parents of young children or immigrant children or children growing up bilingually, being a little bit worried about that learning multiple languages may create some kind of confusion and lead to some kind of learning difficulties or even developmental difficulties. So I wanted to ask you, and this may actually be a little bit of a personal question as a father of a trilingual child, right? And you also are like a proficient multilingual speaker. Would you say that learning multiple languages may create some confusion at different stages of development? For example, if someone learns the languages early, or maybe it's more of a case when someone learns them later in life?
Well, let me answer your question with an analogy. Imagine someone who lives in a world where everything is only black and white. There can be different shades of gray, but basically it's practically black, white, and a little bit of shades of gray in between. And then suddenly someone explains to him that for other people there's a world where you have these incredible rich colors. You can have green, you can have yellow, you can have blue, you can have red. The first reaction probably would be, my God, that must be confusing. How can you cope with all these colors? If things are white and black and white, it's very clear. If there are so many colors, it must be an awfully confusing life. And that is, I think, what happens with monolinguals when they imagine what it is to be bilingual. I think they probably think it must be an incredibly confusing experience. For me, being multilingual, I would say for me, living in a world where I can only use one language would be like going back, losing all the colors and going back to a black and white world. Now, of course, it's possible. You function, you can still read, you can do, most of your activities. But I would say somehow that something gets lost. So the whole idea of confusion comes simply from a monolingual prejudice against something in the world which they simply don't understand, cannot even imagine, and therefore think it must be threatening, worrying, and so on. Already small children are very, very good in distinguishing different languages. And I mean, it's not my special area of research because I work mainly on the kind of later phases in life. But, from my own experience with my daughter and from a lot of experience from other friends and colleagues, and of course from reading of literature, I think everything suggests that children can distinguish languages very, very well. They can still mix them, but in a way that the other person will understand. So let's say if a child knows that, that they understand Spanish and English, they will then mix Spanish and English. But if they speak then to grandmother who doesn't understand English at all, then they will practically move to speaking only one language, or the grandfather who speaks only English, and so on. So from this point of view, I think there is basically a wealth of information. Now, of course, you can also start mixing languages later in life when our attentional functions go down. But that means that looking at this, you start realizing that basically knowing more than one language is like a permanent training of attention throughout the lifetime. And if attention goes down, and I think, many of us might know this feeling. By the way, I can tell you a very, very nice example. Yesterday evening, I came back from Budapest, from European Academy of Neurology, very, very tired. And I mean, we had 2.5 hours delay or 3 hours delay. So I arrived like 3 a.m. And arriving home, it was clearly Indian taxi driver. I go out and I told Auf Wiedersehen. So I told him goodbye in German. Obviously, I was incredibly tired and therefore couldn't kind of quite sort languages. Why it was German? Probably I presume that maybe the last message text that I was writing was to a German friend, so I wrote it in German. So there was still, so to say, the language was still lingering in my brain. But things like this happen. But as I say, in a way, the fact that they happen shows that we apply all this attentional mechanism all the time. Whereas if you speak only one language, you don't usually need to do it. So is it an argument against bilingualism? Well, I would say it's a little bit like saying, well, if I can walk to work and I can drive to work, I could of course drive because it's more convenient, yes. But if I walk to work every day, I get quite a lot of exercise. If I drive, probably less so. And that is exactly the case with bilingualism. So yes, it is correct that if our attention goes down, we can start then sometimes mixing the languages. But that basically means that our attention levels are quite good most of the time, and that is, if anything, a proof of the attentional training that is associated with speaking different languages, which is one, we believe at the moment, the main mechanisms or the main explanations for the cognitive reserve about which I was speaking before.
Okay, thank you very much for all these very interesting stories and answers. So just to conclude our interview, by now probably all the audience can answer this question for themselves. But let's go back to where we started. So is bilingualism and multilingualism a medicine or a poison? What's your take on this one?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Is bilingualism a poison or a medicine? You would have got very different answers in different times. So when I was growing up in Krakow in 60s and 70s, the idea that most professionals had, and my mother was a pediatrician. Both my parents were doctors. My mother was pediatrician. She asked, her fellow pediatricians, speech and language therapists, and so on. And the idea was at least that, a child should have a clear one dominant language, and then later on, maybe at school, it can learn other languages. So basically, the main predominant idea was that it is somehow dangerous for a child to be exposed early to more than one language. And that was the dominant view across most of the modern world. Not across all of the world, because in some areas, like let's say in India or in Africa, multilingualism has been the rule anyway, but at least in Western Europe and definitely in North America. And that changed slowly with more and more studies, first in Montreal, then in Toronto, then in other places from 60s, 70s, showing positive effects of bilingualism, of multilingualism, speaking more than one language, basically originally in children and then later in older people. So from this point of view, I would say within the 50 years, we would get a very, very different view from something which was considered a burden. It has moved to something which is considered to be a blessing. This still leaves the question whether you can get too many languages. I would say for small children, the limiting factor is simply the hours of exposure. There's only a certain number of hours that children are awake, and you need enough exposure to a language in order that the child learns it. It will not learn a language from hearing it, a few minutes or half an hour or so, every second day. So from this point of view, probably it would be difficult to start with more than 3 or 4 languages. But I would say thereafter, sky is the limit. And we have, of course, polyglots who speak more than 10 languages relatively fluently. But I would say 3 to 4 should be achievable for everybody. And then, if you like it, then I invite to the club of 5+.
Okay, so just to wrap up before we finish, could you tell us how many languages do you speak?
Well, that is a very difficult question, how many languages I speak, because it's a little bit like asking, how many friends do you have? Do you mean friends in the Polish sense of przyjaciel, so close friends, of which per definition you have only few, or do you mean friends on Facebook, where most people will have hundreds and hundreds nowadays? I have experience in giving lectures in 7 languages, but I can have a kind of, let's say, relatively simple conversation in some more, and there are some languages which I find easier to read but more difficult to speak. So I would say it will be probably around 10+ if I include simple conversation and reading.
Okay, that's really fascinating and encouraging. Thank you very much for today's interview.